Well, when I'm thinking about an audience of whom I'm writing to, um, it's a single person, but it's not one person, if you know what I mean. I mean, I'm not writing to a group. I'm writing in silence, and I'm thinking of a person in a room by herself or himself reading in silence. So it's a kind of a silent transmission, and I hope a very intimate one. If you read my poems, you realize there are not many people in my poems, except for me. And I think the fewer people you have in your poem, the more alone you are with the reader. So I don't have a lot of uncles and friends, roaming through my poetry. It's basically trying to get the reader into a listening position, and then do something. So it's sort of private with one person, but I don't have an image of that person: male, female, age, white, black, whatever. Well, there are very few people in the poems, but there's plenty of room for birds and dogs and ostriches, and as long as they're.
Occasional elephant.
Well, I read a lot of course, I read a lot of poems, and it's. I think everyone would admit this. I mean, there's a lot of poems I just don't finish reading, and because there are deal breakers, and you can always. It's not like a novel where you've invested 70 pages and you really feel like you should continue. I mean, if you read 10 lines of a poem, you can just bail out and turn the page, and there's another one. But one of the things that makes me bail out is mentioning like mom or dad or my uncle, or all of a sudden I think there are just too many people here, and it should be a short story. Because I think of poetry as very private, the poet and the reader, and that's the communication. Anyone else would be an intrusion. I write about my parents. I never was able to write poems about them while they were alive, but after they were dead, I wrote about them. But yeah, I admit that I have parents, but that's not really giving out too many autobiographical secrets.
It certainly isn't.
And if it's a love poem, there's a beloved in there, but that's about it.
Yes.
Well, titles are very important because they do advertise the poem a little bit. So it's often the first thing you see. Although I find sometimes I just skip the title. I shouldn't do that. But the main thing about titles is the mistake you could make is that a poet uses all the information he or she has about the poem, which is more information than anyone has, and out of that information creates a title, because then you're way ahead of the reader. There should be nothing in the title that a stranger or reader couldn't pick up. Right. So it should be a very simple title like April or Bedroom, or a very explanatory title like I'm sitting in a boat looking at these trees on an autumn afternoon. Etiquette. I mean, I think it's poetic etiquette at the beginning of the poem. I try to be a nice person. I try to be hospitable and invitational, and I try to be welcoming, a good host, you might say, right? But as the poem goes along, things can turn in different directions. I mean, I don't mean that I turn into an evil person once I have you inside the poem, but the poem can be more demanding. It can move into areas of surrealism and instability, into hypothetical, speculative areas. So it's not so clear-cut or straightforward as the poem goes along, but it has to start hospitably. Our Poet Laureate office in the United States is a copy of the British Poet Laureate. That's where we get it. And I did have dinner once while I was Poet Laureate with the British Poet Laureate, Andrew Motion, at the time. We concluded that he had to write occasional poems about certain events, and I just had to write occasionally. Because the American Poet Laureate is not obliged to memorialize national events, for better or worse, in poetry. I was asked to write a poem on the anniversary of 9/11, and I did that, and I read it before a joint session of Congress, which was quite a heady experience. Usually you don't have an audience like that. So that was the one time I wrote a public poem. The poem called "The Names" on the anniversary of 9/11 seemed impossible to write. Excuse me. It seemed impossible to write because of the breadth of the subject and of the public nature of it. But I figured out two things that enabled me to write it. First of all, I realized I could write an elegy, a poem for the dead. So I didn't have to deal with the geopolitical consequences or these large issues. And then I realized I could use the alphabet to work through the poem and let each letter of the alphabet represent those whose names begin with that letter who were fallen. So those two, you can consider those restricting elements, but that actually enabled me to write the poem, yeah. The Lest We Forget memorials, war memorials, usually have a list of names, and it can be firefighters or those fallen in battle, but yeah, clearly the litany of names, it was a tradition that I was stepping into there, and a tradition that supported my little contribution to that. Well, I think poetry of different cultures, there's something very basic that they all have in common, because poets are writing about themes that are very limited, and they're poems of grieving, poems about death, poems about love, poems about gratitude, but this very short list of subject matters, it's just the small things. I have that are not translatable. I have a poem in which I mention a state flower. And every state in the United States has not only a state flower, but a state bird and an anthem and a flag and whatnot. But to a British ear, it probably sounds like an estate flower, like EST.
Yes.
So there are certain words like that that don't quite translate. And you really don't realize how American, I didn't realize how American my poetry was until I came to England and Ireland and read and realized that some of these phrases were not registering.